session. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first virtual IAU Alternating Medical Conference. We have done a bunch of this in the past, but it has all been on site. So the medical committee got together and said, we should probably do something like this and take advantage of the virtual resources that are available to us now. So I really want to thank the medical committee led by Dr. Matthias Reich on initiating this. My name is Nadeem Khan. I'm the president of the International Association of Ultrarunners, and I'm also a member of the medical committee. And so medical is very pertinent in today's day and age, considering the last 2 years of IAU season has canceled because of COVID. And so the medical committee is getting together, sharing ideas on how to bring some of these championships back safely. So that is our main goal right now. And so we wanted to change the track a little bit and talk about the medical aspects of ultrarunning. And we reached out to some very good speakers, and this is going to run over 2 days. The first day, we are concentrating on speakers from North America and Europe, and tomorrow's session, and South America. And tomorrow's session will be more geared towards the speakers from Australia, Oceania, Asia. So we can hit different time zones as well. So it's a bit of a logistical challenge, and but we are ultrarunners. We accept them, we embark on them, and we conquer them. So it's going to be an exciting couple of days. This is going to be about a 2-hour session. We have 3 very, very renowned speakers. And before I introduce the first one, I want to pass on the baton to Dr. Matthias Reich to welcome on behalf of the medical committee, the IAU medical committee.
Thank you, Nadeem. A warm welcome to everybody. And I think I can speak in the name of the medical committee. And I guess since it's a new committee that got elected last year, I would like to name everybody: Beatrice Constantin, Debbie Chu, and Dr. Andrew Bosch, Dr. Richard Lyon Caldwell, Dr. Hilary Walker, and Dr. Nadeem Khan. We are the medical committee, and as Nadeem has already mentioned, right now we are talking about COVID and to see how that affects our events or our coming up events in this year, at least this year for right now, and also how we can improve everything concerning medical positions. The task is to advise the council on any questions they have, and I think we talked about that is also how we could get in contact with the IAU family out there. And I think one of the good things about the new electronical age is that we can get in contact with you through a medium like this one that we are using right now. And we also would like to mention that we are, of course, available to you for personal questions concerning medical things, as far as we can do that without conflicting with any personal and sexual problems. But of course, we are available if you have any questions, and we try to help you if we can. I would like to thank the speakers for making themselves available for this first online conference. And as Nadeem said, it was a pleasure to getting in contact with all of you and talking about what the topics might be and how we're going to develop the topics. And I'm very thankful to everybody that I think we got a quite interesting program together. So I think we should start so we can get the program running. Nadeem, thank you for taking the position as a moderator. You have a lot of experience with this. I have heard you many times during events also. And we are trying to help you out in case there are questions. I think questions, I think we're doing the questions afterwards. So please don't interrupt the talk unless the speaker or the presenter especially says upfront that questions in between he is or he would allow. Otherwise, we're going to collecting the questions afterwards, and I guess we're putting them into the chat. I guess Nadeem, would you like to introduce the technical part? How you would like to run this meeting? I think you have some thoughts on that. Thank you everybody for joining, and I'm very grateful for this event.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. Yes, for any questions, we'll leave the last 5 to 7 minutes of the talk for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and then I'll pick it up from there, and I'll ask Dr. Madrid, as he's the first speaker, about those questions. Once again, this meeting is being recorded. It will be uploaded to the IAU platform later on. And so people who have been unable to join us today will be able to enjoy this conference as well. So our first speaker, I've known him for a long time, Dr. Norbert Madrid from Germany. He was the former head coach of and the team manager for the German national ultrarunning team. Germany's ultrarunning team has progressed a lot under his leadership, and really looking forward to seeing what will happen at our first ever IAU championship in Germany this August. So really looking forward to that. So he did set the stage for bringing the international championships to his home country. Dr. Madrid is going to be talking about is the generally accepted training periodization and the concepts of mileage and speed work training in long distance running adaptable for the ultra distances. It's going to be a critical discord. Dr. Madrid himself is a very accomplished runner. He is 100K of 7 hours and 33 minutes. 24 hours, he has accomplished 216 kilometers, has degrees in microbiology and biochemistry. Dr. Norbert Madrid, the floor is all yours, and thank you so much for your participation.
Okay, so hello, Hillary. Hello, Nadim. Hello, Matthias, and everybody in the worldwide ultra community. I want to cover my 2 topics today from a pure ultra running perspective. Both topics are related, and I will spend 80% of my time on the first topic, periodization, or how training volume and intensity should be distributed over longer periods of time, like several months or even years. But you will get most of my views on the second topic, speed versus mileage, as a byproduct. The major reason why I have volunteered to talk about training periodization, ultra running is different enough from other long distance running in certain aspects. So an ultra specific adjustment of the periodization patterns usually recommended for long distance running may be warranted to ensure optimal ultra performance, short and long term. Optimal meaning either fast times, national or world-class performances for top runners, or more pleasant enjoyment for those of us who do not care too much about PBs and rankings anymore, and years of satisfying ultramarathon running for everybody who discovered our great sport. Another reason, periodization is not only about getting a runner into optimal shape for a key race or a series of races, but it is also a tool to prevent overuse, injuries, and mental or physiological burnout. So proper training periodization is very important for ultramarathon runners who want to enjoy the many positive experiences of ultra running for more than just a few years. A first disclaimer, I do not consider myself at all as an expert in scientific training, and what I will present to you is mainly based on my personal experience as an ultra runner, plus being a coach for several German ultra runners. 35 years of ultra running now and about 10 years of coaching have taught me quite a bit about what may work and what does not work. So I will present opinions, and as usual in the ultra world, strong opinions. Now to topic 1, periodization. The basic principle applied in any sports is to provide variety in what the athlete does in his or her training sessions over the course of a season or several seasons. Training contents like absolute workload, specific skill drills, supplementary exercises, and others will be varied over time with the goal that the athlete will be in top shape for the top event, allowing for short-term recovery to optimal benefit from the training inputs, and also for longer-term recovery between seasons. Generally, a training period of 6 to, let's say, 24 months is divided into various consecutive phases, which are usually called base phase, followed by build or strength phase, then peak phase, and finally off-season or transition phase, again followed by base, build, peak, and so on and so on. The goal of the base phase is to lay the foundation for all the harder work, more specific for the final event to come later in the build phase. The goal of the build or strength phase is to sharpen all the specific skills and capabilities required for the target event, while getting in optimal shape for it. And finally, in the peak phase, all the previous training efforts culminate hopefully in peak performance after a short phase of relative rest prior to the main event called tapering. For long distance running, this generic pattern of base, build, peak, and off-season has been successfully applied and filled with the following training contents. In the base phase, the goal is building aerobic base by higher training volume, weekly mileage, done with an on average low intensity. In the build and peak phases approaching the key race, the emphasis shifts to more race-specific workouts, which means higher intensity and lower volume, more and harder speed training and less miles per week. So the classical periodization pattern for long distance running is simply put, you need a foundation of high mileage, primarily run at slow pace, before you can start the specific training for the target race involving higher intensity workouts and lower weekly mileage. Higher intensity in this context means speed work with faster than 5K race pace effort, at least occasionally, and faster for shorter races. So the classical periodization pattern for long distance running, there are more complicated phase patterns like blending the phases, but in essence, this distribution of low intensity, high volume training in the base phase and high intensity, low volume training in the build phase is broadly applied because it works well for races up to marathons, maybe 50K races. So why not simply adopt this classical pattern also for ultramarathon running by mainly making those damn long runs a bit longer? Well, this is actually what most of the training recommendations for ultra races readily available on the internet or even with paid coaches do, unfortunately. They follow the classical pattern without taking ultra specific requirements seriously enough into consideration. I believe it's a conceptually flawed approach and in practical terms counterproductive for ultra runners, at least in the long run. Why? Because as the race distance increases, raw speed becomes less important and certain physical and mental capabilities beyond cardiovascular and neuromuscular fitness play an increasingly decisive role. Ultra runners need to achieve, for instance, high running efficiency at very moderate paces, aerobic endurance, further gastrointestinal as well as mental robustness, and the ability to cope with biorhythmic lows. Training for an ultra race should emphasize these specific capabilities in the final 10 to 16 weeks prior to the race, that is in the build phase. You build and sharpen these capabilities by increasing workload, by doing extra long runs or back-to-back long runs, including foot uptake, and just any way to spend time on your feet in moderate effort. The jury is still out on the question whether an extra long run or total accumulated weekly mileage will do a better job here. I will come back to this question at the end when I address the speed versus mileage topic. But an ultra runner needs plenty of miles during the final weeks before tapering for the race by increasing the length or frequency of the long runs and other runs, including maybe even 1 or 2 runs during night hours, and cutting down speed work. In classical long distance training, one practical objective of the build phase is to make the hard race pace feel more comfortable to the athlete by including faster than race pace intervals, surges during tempo runs, and so on. Ironically, the longer the target ultramarathon race, the more training is done at faster than race pace already without any speed session. For instance, for a 24-hour race, a race pace of about 5 minutes 30 seconds per kilometer might be adequate for a runner who would run about a flat 5-minute pace or 8-minute miles in his or her usual easy training runs. In other words, easy run pace is already about 10% faster than appropriate race pace. For 24-hour runners, doing more and more workouts at 24-hour target race pace and not the objectively faster pace of their routine easy run may be valuable or even necessary in attaining maximum running economy at this slow pace. In that sense, one important aspect of the classical build phase philosophy is conveniently fulfilled by ultramarathon runners, more emphasis on workouts at or below target race pace. To state it very clearly, the longer the distance of the target race, the more training mileage is run at race pace or faster by the ultra runner, and this completely without doing any classical speed session. 24-hour runners run 100% of their training miles at race pace or faster. This fun fact alone indicates that the classical training menu recipes and rationales behind them have to be adjusted quite a bit for ultra races. Now, what about the so-called quality sessions? Most ultra runners are confronted by other runners or running journal articles who stress the importance of doing quality workouts instead of junk miles. Well, quality in running training does not automatically translate into speed work, at least not for ultra runners in the weeks immediately before their important race. Hard speed workouts leading to muscle lactate accumulation, like intervals at 5K race pace or hill sprints, are probably not at all beneficial for running a 100K, let alone a 24-hour race, and should be avoided by all means in the final weeks prior to the race. Those hard speed sessions are at best a deflection or focus on the more important capabilities to be optimized in the weeks before the big ultra race, and are too often the cause of overtraining or even acute injuries. In most industries, the term quality means optimal fitness for a given purpose or use. For the purpose of running a personally satisfying or even world-class ultra marathon, a long run at easy pace or even slower is a quality workout. By contrast, a hard speed session in the final weeks prior to an ultra race would be considered as a no value added process step and recommended for elimination by a quality engineer from industry. This is exactly what I recommend. No hard speed work in the build phase prior to an ultra race. Nevertheless, I believe that competitive ultra runners also need to do some real speed work. Otherwise, they would still be able to finish ultra races, but no longer be able to compete for winning a race. Plus, they all want to look good running to the finish line. Actually, I believe all ultra marathoners should do some speed work to help avoid overuse injuries based on poor running form. When and what kind of speed work to do is another set of controversial opinions, but in the context of periodization, the advice is do your harder speed work, hard hill repeats, fast track or road intervals, and so on, in your base phase and not in your build phase. Remember, the base phase is supposed to emphasize the foundations and important prerequisites for being so. Remember, the base phase is supposed to emphasize the foundations and important prerequisites for being able to digest a demanding ultramarathon. Build phase training manual later on a good running form and reasonable basic speed. To really prioritize speed means that you have to sacrifice weekly mileage and omit long runs to get the most out of your speed sessions and to decrease injury risk. Later, during the build phase, when you have to handle more weekly mileage, it is a good option to include mild speed workouts in the training menu, but intended more as a speed memory session than a hard speed workout aiming to improve your basic speed. To summarize, the base phase for a serious ultramarathoner should have relatively low mileage, but relatively high intensity workouts, whereas the build phase prioritizes lots of easy miles and only moderate intensity speed workouts, which is just the opposite of classical long distance training periodization. Now, what about building the aerobic base in the base phase? In my opinion, there's little value in trying to build aerobic base, at least for those runners who really focus on running ultras. They are already well equipped here, unless they have taken off several months after the last big ultra marathon. Instead, a low mileage base phase with the focus on speed, supplemented with a few short races run in a more low-key fashion, can be a real fun period if not taken too ambitiously. It adds variety and is a good measure against the physical and mental burnout dangers for ultramarathon runners if they would do the same things over and over year after year. A next disclaimer: this reversed emphasis concept with a low volume, high intensity base phase, high volume, low intensity build phase is not something I invented. A small fraction of the training advice available is already pointing cautiously in that direction without spelling it out very clearly. More importantly, it is applied by many ultra runners in a more or less clear fashion because of their experience, what works and what does not work. For example, two of Germany's most successful 24-hour and Spartathlon runners have told me about their focus on improving their 10K and half marathon times after the last ultra race of the season and after their off-season regeneration phase. That means in their base phase prior to getting in shape for important ultras. Florian Reuss won the 24 hours World Championships in 2015 after he had improved his 10K PB in the base phase prior to getting in shape for the World Championship race. Is this ultra-specific periodization concept something for every ultra runner? I would certainly recommend it for serious ultra marathoners, those people who run ultra races as their main destination and only occasionally race shorter distances, run with a clearly lower priority than their ultra races. What about the runners who only occasionally run an ultra but race more often and more seriously over shorter distances? They are probably well served with the classical base build peak off season phase priorities, for example, only moderate effort runs and building aerobic base in their base phase. However, they will most likely also do better in their occasional ultra race if their build phase prior to this very ultra is like the one for a serious ultra runner, higher volume, lower intensity. And of course, every runner will benefit from an off-season regeneration phase. For all ultra runners, the regeneration phase is the minimum they should adopt in terms of periodization if they intend to run enjoyable ultras for more than a couple of years. By the way, I believe that this proposed reversed emphasis periodization might be a worthwhile consideration for running faster marathons already, for example, for seasoned marathoners. But this is not my topic today. Today, I wanted to sketch out with a broad brush a clear counter proposal to the many one-size-fits-all approaches in which most training programs or coaches apply the classical pattern also for ultramarathons. These lukewarm advices are at best suboptimal, but in many cases lead to an abrupt end of a promising ultramarathon career. Training schemes involving hard speed sessions in the weeks prior to an ultra race have generated much unnecessary frustration and have led to actual damage. And at the very least, the runner will not be in optimal shape for the race, even if she or he survives this approach. Similarly, trying to build aerobic base on a foundation of already ample aerobic base in the base phase that is doing more of the same all the time does clearly not help to avoid physical or mental overuse damage. My general point, the simple extension of classical running training plans into the ultra world is not only suboptimal, but dangerous in many cases. The reversed pattern concept proposed here is much more aligned with the specific challenges of ultra running and is more likely to achieve optimal ultra performance. My views on the second topic, speed versus mileage, should be known to you by now. But for the last part of this presentation and to trigger some discussion, let me summarize and expand. Number one, in the final 10 weeks or so leading up to an ultramarathon race of say more than 50 miles, it is more important to run more miles, practicing to drink and eat and digest while running than to run hard speed workouts. Number two, in the specific build phase for ultras, a large volume up to 100% is run at race pace or faster because race pace equals easy training pace or is even slower for the longer ultra races. Number three, hard speed sessions with intervals at or faster than 5K race pace are not required at all and actually may be counterproductive. Number four, moderate speed sessions, half marathon pace to maximally 10K pace should be on the training menu in the specific build phase as memory workouts to maintain speed and form and might be good against mental or physical boredom. And number five, for the serious ultramarathon runner, the time for harder speed sessions and attempts to improve or maintain 10K or half marathon race times is the base phase. Again, even during this time, if racing ultras in future years is the highest priority, there are more cons than pros running anything faster than 5K pace. Now, after this broad brush black and white picture without any shades of gray so far, I'm well aware of great ultra runners like Camille Herron or Nele Alder-Behrens, who both claim they do not do the long, slow training runs advocated by me. Well, they nevertheless run plenty of miles per week by including tour-days and several medium long runs. Most ultra runners, though, don't have a choice of spreading their weekly mileage as they would like, but as amateurs with real jobs, they have to just put in a larger portion of weekly miles over the weekend. And regarding speed, here is my last black and white picture, turtles and hares. A typical hare ultra runner is a fast marathoner with excellent 10K and even 5K PBs, for instance, fitting that formula 10K time multiplied by 4.66 equals marathon time. The turtle, on the other hand, has a better marathon PB than predicted by the 4.66 times 10K formula, or does not even bother about running or racing 10Ks altogether. Now, in the important weeks before your target race, you better adopt a training program which builds on your inherent strengths, not your weaknesses. The general advice, high mileage and no hard speed work, needs to be fine-tuned accordingly and individually. A hare in ramping up for a 100K may be better off by doing longer interval sessions and medium intensity runs and not so many long, slow runs of 30 miles or 50 kilometers or so. Whereas the turtle type would crash mentally and or physically with such a menu, readily digested by hares. Those ultra turtles need more slow miles, maybe longer lasting long runs than the hares among us. My hunch is, though, that most ultra runners are drawn to our sport because they are more of the turtle type. Well, in reality, runners probably come in all shades of gray. And with this deep philosophical remark, you have reached the finish line of my contribution today.
Thank you, Dr. Madrid. That was really neat. Thank you so much for doing that. I did not see any questions in the chat box, but oh yeah, there you go. So Jacek, our Director of Communication, is asking, Dr. Madrid, can you please be so kind and share your point on doing double sessions per day to compensate for the kilometers during work days?
Yeah, there I have an opinion, but it's not a strong opinion. So I think it's still better to do a real long run than to split the kilometers or miles by 2 a days. But it can be an appropriate measure. So, for instance, if you're coming back from a injury, that would be an option.
All right. So, thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Madrid. Let me see if anything else has showed up in the chat box. No more questions. I do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
You talked a little bit about building the phases and the different phases. Mm-hmm. You talked about all the different 3 different criteria there. So what would you suggest in terms of recovery between those, between one major event and another major event?
Oh, actually, if this is really a major event, I would suggest a complete training cycle, which means 3 months minimum if it's a major event. But most ultra runners run run-up races or getting in shape races before their main event, or they do, let's say, a lower priority follow-up race. But what you cannot expect is to be in top shape for let's say more than 4 or 6 weeks. So, and the recovery after let's say hard all-out 24-hour race is minimum 1 month.
Wonderful. We have a question from Sergei Popov. He's the CEO of Salmon Running Ukraine. Can maximum speed work like 100 be beneficial for ultras? Not sure 100, I'm assuming he's talking about speed work like 100 meters and things like that. Will that be beneficial for ultras?
Okay. Yeah, I think I would say for 99% minimum of ultra runners, it's not beneficial at all. It's dangerous. There may be rare exceptions. Maybe the top athletes, which are more of the hair type anyway, they would benefit. But again, this speed work has no place in the final weeks before a big ultra race.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Madrid. You talked about ultra running and staying in the sport for a long time. What are your trade secrets when it comes to longevity in the sport of ultra running? It is a high impact sport. It impacts your body a lot, but we see a lot of longevity when it comes to ultra running. What's the secret behind
that? I don't think there is any secret. You have to listen to your body all the time, even in times when you think you can win races one after the other. So I think it's always you have to be patient with yourself. You have to sometimes say no to requests from your team to run this and that important race to just fill up the team. So I think that's the most important thing, that you already at the start of your ultramarathon career set a priority, whether you want to, let's say, run a few very good ultra races within the next 2 years, or whether you want to run all your life.
Awesome, thank you. Daniel Alexander is asking, would you recommend a test marathon 4 weeks before a 100-kilometer run?
Yeah, these test races. The question is, what do you want to test? Do you want to test how your stomach behaves under race pace conditions? So I certainly would not run, let's say, an all-out marathon to to demonstrate to yourself that you are in top shape, and therefore you will run a better 100K race, because then you leave it at this test race.
All right, and the last question we have from Sergey again, what is your opinion on optimal training intensity distribution for ultras? For example, he's suggesting, do we train at 80% race pace, 15% slower, 5% faster than race pace?
Yeah, as I said in my presentation, many ultra runners train 100% at race pace or faster, because race pace for their ultra is equals easy training run pace, or is even slower than that. So this training intensity distribution is only let's say adequate consideration in the base phase, when, in my opinion, a serious ultra runner should do some speed work, and there I think more or less the classical recommendations of 80% easy running and 20% faster running still apply. For this base phase with focus on speed for the serious ultra runner, I would again, with the long-term perspective, or for the long-term perspective, recommend to take it easier. So not to run very hard speed intervals. There is speculation about what is it called, let me check here. The blood capillary around the muscle fibers, the capillary density increases a lot with these slow running. And there is speculation that hard workouts, they actually counteract these beneficial effects for ultra running. So if you take this speed base phase too seriously and try to run a national record over 10 kilometers or 5 kilometers, then you are probably disturbing your ultramarathon capabilities, and you have to rebuild them more after that. So I wouldn't recommend anything faster than 5K pace, with the exceptions of the absolute elite. Let's put it this way, and they are probably less than 1% of us.
Awesome. That definitely does not count me as an elite runner, but it does count the person who's asking the next question, a former world best performance holder for several distances, Hillary, our general secretary. A question as a selector, what would you recommend as an indicator of form for athletes?
With the athletes I coach, I have several indicators, so I can, of course, share. Very important is resting heart rate. That's an indicator of form. But what also is short distance test race, a time trial against yourself over, let's say, for each training period, or you run the same stretch of, let's say, anything between 8 kilometers, 12 kilometers, so 5 to 7 miles, and that gives you an indicator, because for each individual runner there is a relationship between shorter long distance performance speed and ultra marathon potential. That's true. That's why Florian Reuss, for instance, tried to improve his 10K. So that's I think, a very practical also indicator, a time trial time.
Very good, Dr. Madrid. Just a comment before we go to the last question over here from Dr. Matthias Reich. He's saying what you're saying is more true for 24 hours than 100 or 50K runners, because the top 150K runners are doing 3:30, 3.5-minute kilometers.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Let's say, but this is true only, again, for the top runners. You have to also take into consideration those slower ones, like myself, who don't run 50K runs now, let's say below 5 minutes per kilometer. So the let's say the 100K runner who runs, let's say, 10 hours for the 100K is more or less, or for him or her, it would be more or less the same as what I said for the 24-hour runners. The race pace is actually slightly slower than usual or routine easy run pace. Yeah.
Very good. So there's one last question before we move on to the next speaker. So how many weeks would you say that each of the phases are, in your opinion? So for example, will the base be 10 weeks, build up would be 10 weeks, and peak would be 4 weeks? Or do you have some other criteria?
That's quite flexible, but it's several weeks per phase anyway. So minimum would be 4 weeks per phase. But for the build phase, I think the building up for an ultra marathon should minimum be 8 weeks.
Wonderful, Dr. Madrid. Well, thank you so much for this very informative talk. It really set the stage for our future presentations over the next couple of days. You not only shared your experience from what you have learned and researched on, but also what you have picked up as a top-notch coach at our World Championships. So thank you, Dr. Norbert Madrid.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to our next speaker. We're actually going to take a little bit of a detour. Unfortunately, Zach Bitter is unable to join us for this session today. He'll join us for tomorrow. He has a conflicted appointment right now. So we're going to move on to who was supposed to be a third speaker for the day. And after this talk, we'll open the floor for some more discussions after the Q&A. And so we definitely utilize our time wisely. But our next speaker, I've seen him in a few events. I believe he lives around Michigan, if I'm not mistaken, maybe not anymore, but he did go to school in Michigan. So not too far from where I'm in Ohio. Top-notch runner, placed very well in World Championships and trophy finals. So it's Dr. Jeff Burns from the United States. He's going to be talking about super shoes, biomechanics, optimum relation to performance, as well as standards. He has degrees in biomedical engineering, kinesiology, and sports sciences. He does his postdoctoral work in University of Michigan. Probably a bad time to tell him that I'm a Buckeye fan from Ohio State, but we'll leave that to the very end. Dr. Jeff Burns.
All right. Thank you, Nadeem. Pleasure to be here. Is there any way, Dr. Reich, that you could allow me to share my screen so I could potentially, I have a PowerPoint?
I can do
No,
yeah.
I'm going to make you the host. If you don't mind, if you can make me the host after your talk.
Okay.
All right. There you go, Jeff.
All right. Let's see. Cool. All right. Yeah. So I'm Dr. Jeffrey Burns, postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan. I'm actually just finishing up my postdoctoral research there. I study running, biomechanics, sports science, and performance. My doctoral work was in running biomechanics as well. But I'm actually just finishing up my postdoc with as a physiologist for Team USA and the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee out in Colorado Springs. So relocating from Michigan, but I will be maintaining an adjunct role to continue this type of research. So with that, that's a little bit of background. And I'm also a competitive ultramarathon runner. Road races are my forte. The road 100K is kind of my sweet spot. I was the U.S. champion in 2016, I've run 6 hours, 30 minutes, and been 5th at the World Championship twice in 2016 and 2018. So this talk is actually especially pertinent for some of the road performances. So yeah, diving right in, we're going to talk about super shoes and this next generation of footwear that we have in running right now. First, I'm going to walk you guys through the mechanisms of what is a super shoe, how does it work, how does it make us faster, and then we'll talk about what it means for performance and how we regulate them. And yeah, then at the end we can ask some questions. So jumping right in, what is a super shoe? I would say by definition, perhaps it is a shoe with a next generation of foam and stiff, rigid architecture within that foam. So the first one that hit the market was the Nike Vaporfly in 2016, or 2017 rather. And ever since then, other brands have come out with versions of that. We'll talk about those in a second. But by and large, that better foam is the critical piece for these shoes. This is what has enabled the faster running. And so conventional running shoes were made of what's called ethylene vinyl acetate, EVA foam. By and large, there are some other foams that were used, but that was the predominant one. And that was it was fine because it was cheap, light, easy to manufacture, and it's been in our shoes since the 1970s. So we're pushing 50 years now. But right around 2015, 2016, Nike started developing a shoe using a different foam, a polymer called polyether block amide. So it's a very different polymer than EVA, and it's lighter, more resilient, softer. And it's much better for running. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But one of the aspects of these new foams is they're softer, squishier. So they need some aspects of stabilization to kind of make your interaction with the ground a little bit more efficient. And that's where kind of these stiffer pieces come in. So that's really what we have going on there, those two pieces. So like I said, the foam is the critical piece, but the architecture is, here we go. The architecture is needed to facilitate the benefits of the foam. So we'll touch on that really quick. Architecture must be two things. It must be embedded and curved. And so what that means is embedded is essentially sandwiched in that foam. And this was when the Vaporfly came out, it had this curved carbon fiber plate going through the foam. So you can see that, this is a schematic of that. And so when you have carbon fiber plates, you could actually put them on the top of the shoe or the bottom of the shoe. It's called bottom loading and top loading. And that's not quite as beneficial as having one within the foam. And then finally, that curved piece allows better functioning of especially the foot and ankle mechanics as you move through foot strike. So it reduces some of the work lost at the metatarsophalangeal joint as you move through foot strike, while also offloading the burden at the ankle. So it really kind of facilitates your foot moving through ground contact. So with that architecture, we have the foams, okay? So the foams, these new generation of foams must be two things to be a super shoe, to be a better foam. They must be more resilient and more compliant. So you'll hear these words a lot over the next few minutes. And so what that means is compliance is essentially the softness, the squishiness. It's the inverse of stiffness. So compliance is for a given force, how much something displaces. And yeah, different shoes have different levels of stiffnesses or squishinesses, right? But our bodies in general really like compliant surfaces. So we've seen in treadmill studies that softer treadmill decks actually reduce the cost of running and make you more efficient. So a softer and softer treadmill is actually more and more efficient. Same thing with shoes or any other surface. And really, shoes are surfaces that we just attach to our feet. So we want something really soft because it offloads the work from our body to do that cushioning. As soon as you land on the ground, your body and your muscles have to cushion the blow from that, and that costs a little bit. And there's a cool line of studies from the University of Colorado that actually had runners running barefoot on an EVA, a treadmill rigged up with an EVA foam belt that showed that this softer surface, independent of the footwear, reduced the cost of running. So just putting on shoes saves us a little bit of energy as opposed to being barefoot because of that slight savings in the cushioning cost. But then the second piece that's equally, if not maybe more important, is that they must be resilient. Well, more important, they really go together. So you can't say which one is more important. But anyways, must be resilient, and resilient is how much energy it returns. So again, our old foams, EVA foams, returned about 65% of energy with each foot strike. Adidas Boost, you guys are probably familiar with, came out in 2013, and that was the first kind of next generation foam that returned about 70 to 75% energy. And that was a big step for the industry. Now that was also a little bit heavier, so it kind of offset the benefit. These new foams return upwards of 80, 85%. So we're approaching like ideal springs. So that's where it comes in. So must be resilient and compliant. And so again, just very simply speaking, to summarize that, compliance is how much a foam squishes down, and resiliency is about how much it squishes back. So we want something that squishes down a lot and squishes back a lot. So how do we test these? This is some of the testing I've done in my lab. We have, a machine that delivers force. Sorry for the noise. Have a machine that delivers force to the shoe, and we measure the load on it, and we measure the displacement of that. And that's, this is a normal EVA training shoe from New Balance, and it's actually a very soft shoe. It's a very thick and squishy shoe. This is the new Nike Vaporfly, which this is one of mine that actually has seen many, many kilometers, miles. You can see how much more that squishes down. This is applying the same force. So you can see it compressing a lot, which means that it's so much softer. It's storing more energy. And because it's more resilient, it's giving it back. So So what does that look like when we analyze these? So these are two shoes. This is an old racing flat. It actually came out around the same time as the super shoes, but it's made of EVA foam. And this is the Nike Vaporfly, one of the new super shoes. So what those stiffnesses and energy returns look like, you can see this is what we call a load deformation curve. So this is that machine you saw that was loading the shoe up and down. We're loading it to the same value each time, about 600 newtons to simulate a heel strike. And during that time, you get the loading and the unloading. So this is the force and this is the displacement. So you can see this slope of this line of how it loads up to that force, and the displacement is the stiffness, which is the inverse of the compliance. So the steeper and steeper the line, the stiffer and stiffer, the less compliant it is. And then this coming back is the decompression. And so using calculus, a little simple calculus, you can take the area under each of these lines to get the energy, the work done. And then the ratio of those can be your energy return. So in mechanics, we think of the area underneath this curve, call it the hysteresis. That's the energy lost within that compression and decompression cycle. So in compression in this shoe, we're storing 1.8 joules of energy, and then we unload it and we get back 1.2 joules of energy. In the new shoes, you can see this curve is dramatically different. It's much shallower. So when you look at those stiffness values, it's almost a third, or it's about a third of that stiffness. It's much, much more compliant. You see this much shallower curve. But importantly, this hysteresis curve is much thinner, much less energy loss. So in compression, we're storing 3.3 joules, and then in decompression, we're getting 2.8 back. So we're storing and returning more energy in this compliant and resilient foam. So it's essentially, adding that in each foot strike, it's doing some of the work that our body would have to do to cushion, but also storing and recycling some of that energy as well. And then like I said, that's looking at the Nike shoe. Every other brand has come up with something that they term a super shoe, but there is a large spectrum of variance on how effective they actually are. And one of my colleagues or collaborators at Stephen F. Austin University just published a really nice study comparing some of these different brands. What they found was that the two offerings from Nike were about 3%, 2.5–3% more beneficial. And for context, some of the original studies on these shoes found this, the original study found a 4% benefit in the first Nike shoes to running economy. And then subsequent studies have found, observed around a 3%, and things like treadmills and other aspects of the design can influence that absolute number. But when you look at it internally, it's around that, 3–4% benefit. So they found 3% benefit in the Nike shoes, but then the ASICS shoes actually compared favorably as well. New Balance and Saucony shoes were about 1.5% more beneficial than a standard racing shoe. But interestingly, the Hoka shoes and the Brooks shoes were not as beneficial. And so one of, some of the reasons that we can get at this, and this is a new project I'm working on right now, is why this is. And its hypothesis is largely related to the characteristics of these foams. So like I said, we're moving away from EVA-based foams, but not all new foams are created equal. So the foams in the Nike shoe is polyether block amide, which is a block copolymer. Saucony also uses this same foam, but they use a different formulation of it. And then New Balance uses I believe a thermoplastic polyurethane, which is actually similar to the Adidas Boost. So it's kind of like, you could think of that as almost like a rubber that's been foamed. But they use what's called nitrogen. They use nitrogen as a supercritical fluid to expand it and make it lighter. So it has slightly different properties than these other ones. Hoka still uses EVA, and I think Brooks uses EVA foam that was also using a supercritical blowing agent in the foam. So they all have aspects of these super shoes. They all have plates in them. They're all a little bit lighter, but they don't have those favorable foam characteristics. And so this is some of the testing that I've done there. You can see, really interestingly, when we look at these foams, the Nike shoe, you can think of this stiffness value in this test, it was 43 kilonewtons per meter, returning 85% energy. If we look at the, I think a really nice illustration of this is you look at the New Balance shoe and the Saucony shoe, and the New Balance shoe is very soft, very compliant. So it has a similar slope to that Nike shoe. The 53 kilonewtons per meter is pretty similar to that, but its energy return is not as good. You can see more energy lost in this hysteresis. So it's soft and it stores a lot of energy, but it can't return quite as much. The Saucony shoe, on the other hand, which is the same chemical composition of foam as the Nike, but foamed a little bit differently, has that same energy return. You can see the hysteresis is less energy lost, around 83% here versus 85%, but it's much stiffer. It's not as compliant. So you can't store quite as much energy in it. And then the Adidas shoe, interestingly, is like a hybrid of that, where it's better than EVA shoes. It's soft, 56 kilonewtons per meter, and returns 80% of energy, but it's not quite where the Nike's at on each of those. So you can see all these different brands. To me, as I move through this testing, it's clear that they're not quite there in terms of how they've caught up. But that's where, that's kind of the next frontier of this, is how we evolve those. And then the other aspect of it too is how individuals respond to these super shoes. So this is part of that project. I'm looking at regional differences in these shoes. So you can see this is the Alpha Fly, one of Nike's newest shoes that not only has this foam, but they also put these air pods underneath the shoe. And you can see different properties in the compliance throughout the regions of the shoe. So in all the different regions, it has about 85% energy return as you move through the shoe. It's very consistent, again, with that foam. But in different regions, it has different compliances. So in the heel, it's similar to that Vaporfly, 42 kilonewtons per meter. But in the midfoot, it's very soft. Like, look how shallow that, not steep that line is. So, so very, very compliant in the middle of the shoe. But then the opposite in the forefoot, underneath those pods, it's a little bit stiffer, 54 kilonewtons per meter. So you can imagine different runners with different foot strikes, and it becomes really challenging to think about how you would even tailor or prescribe these. But I think that's kind of maybe one of the next frontiers is figuring that out. And then finally, one of the last pieces on the individual side, this is, pressure patterns from runners running in these shoes on a treadmill that has a pressure plate instrumented, so you can see a real-time map of individual's foot strike. This is the old Adidas Boost, which is what the original, or the marathon world record, was set in before these. And you can see this runner, he's a midfoot striker, lands on the outside of the shoe, and his foot strike moves through it. Same thing roughly on both feet. When he runs in the Vaporfly with that, very soft, squishy, diffusing foam, and that curved plate, that plate sucks his foot in very sharply to the middle of the shoe and moves through, and it's even more pronounced on the right shoe. So how individuals interact with that kind of rigid architecture is also another source of, differentiation in the response. So figuring that out, I think, is another important piece for this. And then, getting to the performance side. So, we talked about how these benefit our cost of running, our running economy. Thinking back, it might be on the order of, 4 or 5%, maybe 3%. So in that ballpark, how does a benefit to your running economy actually translate to racing speeds? There's been, some different studies and thoughts on this. One of the first ideas that came out around these shoes was, how do we translate essentially an economy benefit on a treadmill to a road running benefit out in the wild? And there are two factors that affect how your efficiency in the lab translates out into the road. The first is the predominant one, and that's air resistance. The faster and faster you run, air resistance increases as a quadratic term. So it goes up and up and up the faster you go. And then the second is there's a nonlinear increase in oxygen consumption, which means the faster you run, it's not quite linear in the scaling of the oxygen. So, but the air resistance is really the one that drives that. And so what that ends up meaning is that if you get a 4% benefit from these shoes in the lab and your energetic efficiency, the faster and faster you run, you might start to go below that 4% in terms of a projected speed improvement. So they did a nice modeling exercise where, if we look at a 4% improvement in running economy, at about 3 meters per second, it's a 1-to-1. So if you're running 3 meters per second, which I think is about 5.5 minutes per kilometer, so about 840 mile pace, your 4% benefit in economy is going to be a 4% benefit to your speed. But as you go faster, it starts to decay. So at world record marathon paces, if we're looking at 5.7, 5.8 meters per second, which is like, 255 per K, or what, 436 or something like that for the mile, 440 per mile. You're looking at maybe 2.8% benefit to the speed. But then interestingly, when you run slower than that, slower than the 3 meters per second. So if you're running, 6 or 7 minutes per K or 9, 10 minutes per mile, you're actually getting you could be getting more of a speed benefit. So there's interesting attributes there. And then, and actually this was confirmed by the New York Times, did this really cool big data analysis of runners who had run in these shoes versus old shoes and their marathon performance improvements. And they found that kind of the back of the pack marathoners, the 4 or 5 hour marathoners were improving by about 5% in the shoes. And then the top end guys and gals who are running, around 220 for the marathon or even faster, were improving by about 3%. So there is this kind of graded benefit in terms of the speed. But what's interesting is a new study that just we're currently writing it up right now. The data is analyzed, looked at the treadmill benefit at very slow speeds, because a lot of these early studies that were done on these shoes looked at faster speeds, 14 kilometers an hour and faster, which is essentially 650 mile pace, or 415 per kilometer. So faster than that. So this study looked at them at 10 and 12 kilometers per hour, which is like 5 and 6 minutes per kilometer. So 10 and 11 minutes per mile, or 11 and 12 minutes per 10 and 12 minutes per mile. Sorry, doing these conversions. And they found that the economy benefit was slightly blunted at those lower speeds. And one of the reasons we're thinking is because at those lower speeds, runners aren't putting enough force to fully compress regions of those shoes and really use the full elastic potential of them. That's speculation. But so there could be, these kind of like multifactorial things related to how fast you run in these shoes. But broadly speaking, I think they're substantially beneficial, across speeds for different reasons, perhaps. And then the last piece of how they might affect performance, and this is one that has not received nearly as much study, but I think is one of the paradigm changers, is how they affect your fatigue resistance throughout a race. There was a study actually it was presented at a footwear biomechanics conference several years ago from the Nike Sports Research Lab, where they measured markers of muscle damage in runners after a marathon, and they were substantially lessened in these shoes compared to normal training shoes. And then they also did one where they matched runners on heart rate as they moved through hard training over several weeks, and runners were able to sustain faster paces for a given heart rate in these shoes compared to normal ones. And I think all of that kind of painted this picture that you have enormous amounts of anecdotal evidence from athletes as well using these shoes, is that they really dramatically lessen that mechanical, I've been calling it the mechanical trauma of running, but that feeling of your legs being, not just sore, but like tired and exhausted from a structural standpoint. And so they drastically changed that. In fact, the first time I ran in these shoes, my first thought was, wow, this feels like cycling, from the sense of like, you don't have that impact. It feels like a much more fluid muscular action rather than any sort of kind of, breaking and jarring aspect that you might get from old racing shoes. So I think that, one of the open questions there for me is, does this affect, how our economy changes over long distance and ultra distance races? As we know, economy deteriorates like in a hard road marathon. Do these shoes blunt that? And maybe certainly over the course of a long ultra marathon, I would suspect, that could go as well. Could we preserve it? I think that's a really interesting opportunity for study. So finally, we have all of these aspects, how they work, how they affect our performance. How are they regulated? When they first came out, they weren't regulated. The World Athletics didn't really have a very robust regulatory strategy for footwear. They had kind of just a flowery language of shoes must not provide a mechanical assistance or advantage. And this is a problem because once this stuff started to roll out, we no longer, it shifted the focus away from the athletes. So we were constantly distracted by the shoes, talking about to what extent were shoes affecting performances. Anytime something new came out, we were wondering, is it fair? Is it not fair? And so there was a vacuum for this. And so myself and a colleague at the University of Cape Town proposed this idea that we just regulate shoes simply based on the thickness of them. And this was motivated by, my background's in engineering. I didn't want us to go down the road of having all of these engineering constraints on shoes, like regulating the thickness or regulating the compliance and the resilience and all of these things. I think the way that you write those test methods is too hairy, and it would be too much. It would be too much of an operational burden for World Athletics. Moreover, I don't know, as we want to restrict ourselves from using these better foams. Like I said, if there's that aspect of lessening muscle damage and really kind of changing the sport in that way, maybe that's something that we want to do. So this was really a compromise, and it was motivated both by compromise, but also by operational simplicity, in the sense that we simply regulate the thickness of shoes, which is akin to regulating the mechanical length of the spring. So the longer and longer a spring you have, the more and more energy you can store and return in it for given properties. So it's really about kind of limiting the mechanical and geometric extent to which you can add something artificial to the body. So we proposed this in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, got a lot of positive traction. And for context, the thickness of these shoes, this is one of the ways that they drastically deviated from other shoes, because this foam is so much lighter. We didn't even get to that early on. You can add a lot of it. So it's much less dense than traditional foam. So these shoes are on the order, the first prototypes of the Vaporfly measured at 31 millimeters for their heel thickness. The next generation, this is the Vaporfly Next Percent, it's 36 millimeters. So we propose just something in this ballpark, like keep it around that. And then we can preserve these shoes that we have now, set the rules here, and then move forward with it. So World Athletics, a few months after we proposed this in January of 2020, adopted something very similar, where they set thickness limits on the shoes. They said 40 millimeters for a EU 42, and set, they defined ways to measure it, which I think are still lacking and need development in how they write those test methods for how you do that. And moreover, I think the thickness probably should be graded by the size of the shoe. But broadly speaking, this is a good first step. And since they did that, they've iterated on the rules several times, and now they actually have a whole separate book in the competition rules on athletic shoes regulations. It's book C2 1A for anybody who wants to read it. These are some excerpts, and we now have different thicknesses for different events. So for road races, what we're looking at, 40 millimeters. Interestingly, for mountain and trail races, they don't regulate it at all. And I believe when I'm done, Nadim can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the IAU has adopted these similar regulations. So we use that 40 millimeters, broadly speaking, for our races. But then certainly for mountain and trail races, not regulated. So yeah, so now what that looks like is shoes are measured before a lot of major events. But what's interesting is that 40 millimeter limit applies to the EU 42, which again is, you know, I think there's different manufacturing processes scale the shoes differently. So it's measuring just each shoe outright is probably not as straightforward as it should be, but hopefully that's kind of an area for development. And so, you know, what that looks like moving forward, some of these new offerings have pushed right up to that limit. And so where that goes, yeah, we'll see. Yeah, so kind of wrapping all that up now, you know, I like to say athletes are definitely faster, but they're not necessarily better. And so we have to think, you know, we really think of quality of a running performance. Yes, you have speed, but really what we think of a good performance is really in relation to its rarity, its scarcity. And that doesn't change with the shoes. We just kind of shift everything. So you can think of it almost like inflation. So we've inflated times and we've now hopefully stabilized it a little bit. But we now need to look at performances as not, you know, not better in a historical sense, but just a little bit faster. And so it is one of those things that creates some confusion when a record is broken, because now, you know, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of records broken. I think most ultra marathon records have been broken. You know, the 100K world record was set in these shoes. The 100-mile world record was set in these shoes. The 24-hour world record was set in these shoes. And I would certainly say, at least for the amount that, like, for example, for the 100K record that it was broken, now Kazami in Japan breaking, was it Ichida's record maybe also? Going from 611 to 609, I think if I got those numbers correct. I would say that the shoes made up almost certainly much more of that time, in the sense that, yes, he ran faster, but I think the original world record was probably a more exceptional performance. Because if we think of that 3% benefit, you know, for speed in 100K, we might be looking at, you know, 7, 8, 9 minutes. So we have to think of, you know, when we see records, it's going to be hard for these next few years, because we're kind of resetting the record books, and we can't make quite direct performance comparisons. But we are certainly faster in these shoes. And so, you know, when we're looking at those foams, we want the lightest, most resilient foam with a good amount of compliance. And how it affects performances is certainly multifaceted, and it's different for every single individual. And then, you know, I think there are certainly new opportunities moving forward when we look at training with them. Yeah, we can open it up to questions now. Nadim, I'll make you the moderator, so you can, let's see. So you can maybe field the questions.
Awesome.
Do you know where,
let's see. If you go to the participant list, you'll see my name. If you can just make me the host from there.
Okay. Make host.
All right. And if you can stop sharing as well, that's awesome. So wonderful, Dr. Burns. Thank you so much for that very informative session. I was thinking to myself, would I be a better runner back in the 90s and the early 2000s if I had better shoes?
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. better is that's the.
I'll be faster.
Faster, yes.
Faster, not better. So there you go. Hillary is nodding her head in a hurry. She goes like, "Yeah, absolutely, Nadim." So we have been on council for, oh man, I can't even remember. I can't count that up high, Hillary, how long you and I have been on council now. But Jeff, you did post a question about what is the IAU stance on the shoes. I'm going to pass that on to Dr. Hillary Walker, as she was very intricately involved with World Athletics and our discussions with them. She is trying to unmute herself. There you
All right,
go.
that takes a while. Our stance is exactly the same as World Athletics in that we allow the shoes up to that 40 millimeters, but we also ensure that our track races count as road races. So it's the identical regulations that are for marathons are for all our events, whether it's on the track or whether it's on the road.
Great.
Does that help?
Thank you, Hillary. So we have a few questions here, Jeff. All right, the first one is from Matt. He's saying we have seen a lot more overuse tendopathies in the 80s when the shoes got cushioned. Do we have to fear that this will happen again? Because if I interpret your slides correctly, the contact time is prolonged in the shoes that returns with more energy.
Yeah, it's a good question. I actually think that the way that these affect injury risk is definitely unknown, or rather not very well understood at this point. I think it's certainly plausible to think it will change injury etiologies because the foam is different, those plates are different. It just creates a very different interaction with the ground. What I always recommend to people that are using them is just incorporate them very slowly into your training. Because I think humans, we actually have a very incredible capacity to adapt to things if given sufficient doses of stress and, sufficient recovery from that. So if you slowly work them in, I think they can be perhaps adapted well. I would say injury links to other footwear characteristics are not really well played out. There are just enormous number of factors that go into it. But I do think that these definitely introduce a new risk to runners. What that new risk is I don't know if there's anything generalizable, but I think just because it's so different, that in itself is a risk. That should just be brought in with caution. But I would also say, to play devil's advocate on the flip side, there could be opportunity for reduced injury risks with these, in the sense of that foam, really preserving muscle integrity through training. So I think it's one of those things where there's a lot of different factors coming in, both beneficial and potentially detrimental, that might just create, I always say, runners are going to find a way to get injured. It just might be like slightly different injuries, because that's the nature of our sport, is pushing ourselves to the limit. And when you routinely do that or get close to it, you come up on those limits. So broadly speaking, I think injury risk, yes, it is, because it's something new and has very distinct attributes. It should be approached with caution, but shouldn't be avoided. It should just be taken in slowly.
Very good, Jeff. No, thank you for explaining that. I really enjoyed your presentation. There were a couple of slides that I really got into. One was obviously the video you showed. I've never seen something like that before, so that was kind of cool, and how you did your research. You and I have talked about this in the past as well. The question I have is that one of the graphs was really interesting, where you had compliance and it was the energy that you're putting in once you're pushing in, and the energy you're cutting out once it comes back to its regular spot. Does the time factor also play a role on how much does it take for it to bounce back? And we're talking about milliseconds over here. Will that make a huge difference as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's actually something, I think, broadly speaking, if you do it below the spring, or I call it the spring, because the foam functions as what we call a dampened spring. And every spring has an optimal resonant frequency for which it could naturally unload fast enough. So it would need to be slower than that optimal resonant frequency, which that's what this contact was on the order of 10 milliseconds. So, that's like a typical foot strike might be 20, 25, maybe even 30 milliseconds at the speeds that, we might be thinking about in an ultra marathon. And so that 10 millisecond time course was very short. So it's representing a very fast impact that I'd have to go back and check my calculations, but I think is within the range of that optimal resonant, or it's faster than the, or slower, I'm sorry, than the resonant frequency. But yeah, so broadly speaking, that's what we would need the time difference. But if it's slower than that, then it should have, you know, sufficient time to kind of unload well.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. Hillary is making a personal comment. I have the latest Nike version, which reduces the discomfort from some localized osteoarthritis in one knee to 0. She's showing her shoes right now. There is a different feel to that cushioning effect in those 80s shoes. I'm thinking 80s shoes from the back in the 80s, right, Hillary? Yeah. The next question is from Sergey from Ukraine. What is the best practices to train in ordinary shoes and compete in super shoes, or train and compete in the same type of shoes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. That's actually something I'm trying to figure out myself right now. I think broadly speaking, my current working hypothesis is that it's good to do at least 1 or 2 sessions a week in them, like doing your faster specific sessions in these shoes, I think is important. Both from the recovery standpoint of being able to get in that work, and also not incurring that muscle damage, so you can move through training potentially more safely, but also for that adaptation and specificity. You know, I think about if I'm going to be, that was one of the things I was very nervous about running my first ultra in these, is like, if I'm going to be spending 6-7 hours in these shoes, like how is that going to feel at the end of it? And I can tell you, when you get really, really exhausted and on the limit, and especially when you start running a little bit slower, I found that the plate architecture can certainly affect your gait a little bit differently than when you're fresh. So I think training in them somewhat frequently is important to understand that and to adapt to it. So to harness the benefit, but also to better adapt yourself to it. So I think, 1 to 2 times a week is important. And then the open question for me now is like, is more frequently, is there, benefit to be had? I think it goes back to that injury risk question, is there are almost like 2 competing things here, where like you have the benefit of this much more favorable foam on your body that could potentially facilitate more running, or maybe just better recovery from the same amount of running. Or you also have very new attributes of this very soft, squishy, somewhat unstable surface with very distinct stiff surface embedded in it that could habitually, perturb you as you run at different speeds. So right now I use somewhat normal shoes. I actually use shoes that have these new foams in them, but no architecture, no plates, as a day-to-day trainer. And then for my interval sessions and longer specific sessions, I use the super shoes. So I think using a mixture is important. And one final thing I'll add to that is I've actually been very impressed at how well that foam holds up. One of the early thoughts on them were like, oh, these are going to wear out really fast. I've actually found doing that same mechanical testing on new versus moderately used versus heavily used shoes, they maintain the energy return and the compliance better than EVA shoes do. So like I've tested the Vaporfly at over between 500 and 600 kilometers, which is 250, 300 miles, or no, over 300 miles. And it almost entirely preserved that energy return. It was still at like 83%. They actually break down faster solely just from the foam getting ripped up on the bottom. So they kind of like mechanically deteriorate, or I would say they structurally deteriorate more than they mechanically. So I think using them in training is actually a good thing on that front as well. So.
Thank you, Jeff. One last question from Matt. How many kilometers or miles can you run in the modern shoes before they lose their return of energy capacity?
See previous answer. Yeah, like I said, the foam holds up really well. I honestly have to swap them out not from a deterioration of that foam quality, but once they get torn up on the bottom, because they're so light, they don't have much rubber protecting them. That's at least the Nike ones. I think some of the other brands actually hold up a little bit better, but they're not as, I don't think they're quite as beneficial, at least, certainly for me and probably for most people. But that Nike foam holds up really, really well. So I get more miles out of them more kilometers out of them than I did out of my old EVA racing shoes, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. So I really want to thank Dr. Burns. I mean, that was an outstanding presentation. I learned more about shoes than I ever thought I would. So it's more than just going to my local running store and picking up a pair. So Dr. Burns, thank you so much. Even though you're from Michigan and I'm from Ohio, I want to take this opportunity to thank you and hopefully beat you this season in football and basketball. So
yeah,
thank you, Jeff.
Football season was pretty nice.
Awesome.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you all.
So ladies and gents, we have a few minutes left. Let's open this up for discussions. This has been a very, very robust discussion so far. So thank you for everyone participating. For this one, you can actually unmute yourself, raise your hands, and then I'll ask you to unmute yourself. So the question I have is, we have listened to two very, very dynamic talks over here with Dr. Madrid and Dr. Burns about training, how to get around ultra running, and equipment. Back when I got into the sport, I've been running since I was like 5 years old. And so it was all about, not ultras, short distances. So it was all about training back then. And then nutrition started becoming a part of this entire regimen. And now, listening to Dr. Burns talk, we can agree, equipment is becoming a big part of this. So any thoughts on this transition that has happened over the years? And also, what other entity or different level are we going to be adding next after the training, the nutrition, and the equipment? Thoughts? Please raise your hands, and then we can start with our speakers first while you folks collect your thoughts. I'll start with Dr. Madrid, and then I'll move on to Dr. Burns.
You should give me more time to think, Nadim. I'm the oldest guy here, so I need more time.
All right, I'll go to Dr. Burns and I'll come to Dr. Madrid. Yeah, so I'll say, I think there are a couple of things. One, I mean, I think those three pieces are actually kind of like pillars, essentially, of I always like one of the analogies I always use is us as cars. And so I think of like from the mechanical side and our structural aspects, that's the chassis, and then the physiological side is the engine. And so training is really, like, I would say largely refining the engine, but also continually tweaking the chassis to kind of to handle that and to be it. Our equipment is really upgrading the chassis, and the nutrition is really augmenting the engine, or facilitating that. And so I think those are kind of very canonical ancillary pieces that really runners have always thought about those and struggled with them. And I think it's just now that we've had certain advances in science that we could actually better win on those kind of major pillars. So I would say that those are things that are going to be, the next phase will be maybe, actually, no, I just thought of one, but I was going to say better personalizing those aspects. But I actually think one of the next substantial waves that we're going to see is better intensity monitoring. So we're seeing explosions in, certainly we have heart rate. I think using heart rate to better monitor ourselves is something that done for a while, but I think we're going to be taking that step further. We're seeing uses in heart rate variability to monitor recovery. But then I also think other biomarkers like lactate, maybe even cortisol. I think these kind of personalized health metrics to better tune our intensity, that, you know, in which we train. I think that's kind of going to be the next frontier, is this better training monitoring from the sense of kind of physiological metrics. So I would say that's another big frontier. Another one that you could look at might be, I don't know if this will change, but I just wrote a big long piece on the surfaces on which we run. But I suspect there's going to be more attention given to surfaces. I really think for like ultra marathons, like a track is the absolute fastest thing you can run on because of those favorable resilience and compliance aspects. So, you know, surfaces and certainly better predicting and tuning weather conditions. So those ideas of, and even pacing within a race, better understanding pacing strategies. So I think these kind of like competition execution things of like the environment, surface, pacing, those are all things that are going to be subject to kind of more robust optimization as well. So I just threw a bunch at you.
That's good, Jeff. Thank you so much. That's interesting because I think Jeff was in Doha. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff. You were in Doha. Dr. Madrid was there. Matt was there. Hillary obviously was there. So a bunch of us were there. And we got a tour of Aspire facilities over there. And they took us through these rooms that they create high altitude in. Oxygenated stuff too. So it's kind of cool that people actually go there and start training. So we are taking this to a whole different dimension now. And you can actually train in 120-degree weather and you don't even know, right? So it's pretty neat. Dr. Madrid dropped off, so I think he's still thinking about the question I asked, but in the meantime, I'll go to Jacek. Jacek, go ahead.
No, I'm here.
Oh, Dr. Madrid, you're there? Okay. Okay, you're back. All right, Dr. Madrid, you go, and Jacek after that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think Jeff talked about better intensity markers, and I would say the unsolved riddle of, let's say, training in general, but especially long distance training, is when to do your next or training or your next workout. Because we all know this nice graph where you show there is this training stress, and then you go down in your performance potential, and then the super compensation starts, and you can build from a higher platform the next workout. But nobody has an idea what time is needed before you have this super compensated higher platform level to do your next workout. And I think that probably will become a little bit better understood with better markers. I mentioned this resting heart rate. There are heart rate variability things, but I think these are all proxies and not well understood. So I certainly hope that, let's say, sports scientific studies will show these and these parameters also give you the optimal, the indication for now being ready for the next workout. Because in a well-designed training plan, you never know as a coach whether the athlete is still tired from the previous workout or already recovered. You just make an estimate, a guesstimate, and I think that would be a great achievement.
Yep. No, thank you, Dr. Madrid, bringing statistics and research to a whole new level there. Jacek, sir, you're next.
Yeah. So hello, everybody. My running experience is more from 100 kilometers, but I'm really fascinated about 24 hours, and I had a chance to look at this distance in time for a number of years already, not purely as a runner, but let's say observer, trainer, or coach, or whoever, statistician. And we actually look quite deeply in the statistic when we were having a world championships in Albi in 2019 for Camille or Alexander Sorokin performances, and all the surrounding that was happening and diversity that's happened in the couple of years when I noticed starting in Italy and then moving through Belfast. So all the surrounding around the athletes, trying to push them to stay on the course as much as possible. So everything matters, changing the gears, feeding. So I think the transition, what you, Nadim, mentioned, starting from nutrition and then now moving to shoes, there's a lot of think around, and 24 hours is a very good example how details are important. And what I mentioned about the Albi, when we were looking in the statistic, the top athletes, they keep steady pace for very, very long time. And I know personally Alexander Sorokin very well. He was always trying to push, but there was always this gap between the finish line, this 24 hours. So he was going very fast and very strong and then struggling, but finally he managed. And there are many athletes that succeeds because of all these aspects, nutrition, shoes, and maybe they were not using that many with the new technology in the past, but now when we are seeing this is becoming like a consolidated and complete structure to deliver to performances that we see right now. 100 miles, 24 hours, extraordinary results, and I think this is paying off. So that's what I noticed, and I would like to share it.
Thank you, Jacek. And no, I mean, that's how the talks were presented today are laid out, at least with training followed by nutrition from Zach and from equipment, i.e. shoes from Jeff. So we'll be hearing more from Zach tomorrow's session. So no, that's very interesting point, Jacek. And I think Hillary just pointed out that there's a mental aspect to it as well. And all of us who have done these distances, pretty much everyone on this call knows that at some point it's a fight between the mind and the body. The body's giving up, but the mind wants to keep pushing. And it's how strong, which one wins at the end it tells you who's standing at that 24-hour finish line. So that's very interesting. Any other thoughts or comments or points of discussion? Yes, Richard.
Lion here. As a aging ultramarathoner of 44 years in the sport, I sort of reemphasize what Hillary said, in the sense that I think sometimes you can get so involved in heart rate and everything else, but having been in numerous world championships. I mean, I'll use an example. The final sprint Jeff did at Croatia to preserve fifth place had nothing to do with looking at heart rate or everything else. It was just what went on in his mind. And I think sometimes you can overthink it, because I've seen it in the races at the 100K with the US team, is there have been athletes who stopped who you knew could go on, and you had other athletes who you thought, I don't even know how they're going on, but it wasn't dealing with nutrition and everything else. It was what was going on mentally.
Yes. Dr. Madrid and Jeff, do you want to touch into that mental aspect when it comes to the sport of ultra running?
Yeah, sure. I love that Hillary and Lion brought this up and touched on it, because I think, to my analogy about the car, I talked about the chassis and the engine, but I didn't mention the driver, and that's what the mind is, and that's you can have the everything rock solid, but if you don't have the desire, the plan, the presence of mind, to go out and execute and use all of yourself, enormous fluctuation. So I think all of those things that we talked about, these percentage benefits on equipment or whatever, or how you move through training, none of that is possible without being right between the ears. I absolutely think that's it, and it's one of those things where also it interacts with those other aspects where it's like we are almost always certainly more capable of what we give on a given day if we're not dead at the finish line. But that being said, there's also, really complex psychological, emotional regulation as to how we're able to extract as much as we can from ourselves. And that's one of the maybe one of the final frontiers. Maybe it's something that I hope we don't ever even learn how to fully tune, because I think that's what makes sport, right? It's like, as soon as we could come up with an algorithm for refining mental characteristics and tuning them, then we've become robots. So I think that mental side is certainly, that's almost, I would say there are strategies, certainly sports psychology is huge, and there are different ways that you can train and work on those aspects. And I think a lot of my own training incorporates mental preparation, from trying to simulate race conditions to putting myself in training situations that impose a lot of stress and anxiety to get through them. So I think all of those things kind of sharpen those tools, but it really is, there is an art to that, in the sense of a lot of these things that we discussed about are scientific. That's where understanding kind of the human spirit and your own human spirit is certainly an element of art.
Thank you, Dr. Burns. Move on to Dr. Madrid and then go to Dr. Reich.
Yeah, I already want to pick up on Matthias, but your nutritional status and your lactate influences your mind and stamina. I think, or I always believe that the mind cannot be separated from the body. So the usual saying, the body is ready, but the mind has given up, is, in my view, not a correct representation of what's going on, because it's all together. So some 20-30 years I bought a little booklet called Holistic Running. and I think that's what we do more or less well. Holistic running, we always run, the mind runs with the body runs with the mind, and you cannot really separate. Nonetheless, what Jeff talked about, there are definitely strategies how to visualize difficult situations in your race, how to cope with them prior to the race, so you can develop some strategies, some mental, I don't know, routines but this is certainly one thing I'm very interested in, and every ultra runner is learning race by race and never ceases to learn. So some days it's you achieve what you thought to be impossible, and some days you just hang on and okay. So the mental aspect, what I want to say is the mental aspect cannot be disconnected with all the physical changes which you undergo during an ultra marathon, and this is also for me one of the reasons why I advocate these long, slow runs, because you cannot simulate, let's say, the race fatigue, the negative thoughts you may get after 5 hours, 6 hours running when you run a test marathon in 2.5 or 3 hours.
Wonderful, Dr. Madrid. And yeah, you said impossible. And here in the US, we say the only way you can spell impossible is by saying I am possible. So, and we ultra runners prove that over and over again. Dr. Reich, do you want to have some closing thoughts before I close down the conference? Dr. Matthias Reich.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I think that Zach wasn't available. It was my mistake. In the preparing, somehow that slipped through. I had it prepared, but it didn't get set out. So, but I think time-wise, we are about what we wanted to achieve anyways. Abir was kind of flexible, would be able to talk later, but I guess we are gonna just stay this tomorrow. I just communicated with her. And I think the discussion was very interesting. I think there were a lot of questions, which is good. That shows that everybody is not just listening in, but participating. So thank you very much for that. And I think we got a very good grasp on the topic. And hopefully tomorrow we can even go further into the discussions too. And especially with the topics we are listening to. I think they add up very well to what we heard today, and we're getting a bigger picture than we have already what we heard today. So thank you all very much for participating, especially to the presenters, and hopefully we will see you all tomorrow morning.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Reich. So at this point, I want to thank Dr. Madrid, Dr. Burns for being a huge part of this conference today, making it successful. As Dr. Reich said, we are going to be meeting again tomorrow, which will be 5 o'clock, 5 a.m. UTC time, 1 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So Dr. Reich is going to keep me up all night moderating these sessions. We're going to have Mr. Gary Mullins, based out of Australia, talking about training and tapering, followed by Dr. Rajat Chauhan. He's going to be talking about cognitive strategies and mental toughness, which is very good because that's what we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes. He's based out of India, followed by Dr. Abira El Khatib from Lebanon, and she's going to talk about strength exercises. And then we'll have our last speaker, Mr. Jeff. Sorry, not Jeff, but Zach Bitter, come back and talk to us more about nutrition.
Well, with Zach, I'm in communication. Maybe because of time-wise, it would be best to get him up first because otherwise he's running late. So we will be discussing that, and then we're gonna get the best way out of it as we can.
Yeah.
So hopefully you can join tomorrow.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. So yes, you should have links. Hopefully Jacek has sent links to all the ones who have registered. And this is great. We should probably do this more often. We don't do it enough. And once again, without your support, without the support of our speakers, IAU wouldn't be what IAU is. So it's your organization as much as it's our organization. So let's grow it together. Thank you so much. Stay safe. We'll see you again in a few hours. Take care of yourself. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.